Kaz followed East Stave toward the harbor, through the beginnings of the Barrel's gambling district. The Barrel was bracketed by two major canals, East Stave and West Stave, each catering to a particular clientele, and separated by a tangle of narrow streets and minor waterways. The buildings of the Barrel were different from anywhere else in Ketterdam, bigger, wider, painted in every garish color, clamoring for attention from passerby. The Treasure Chest, the Golden Bend, Wendell's Riverboat, the best of the betting halls were located further north in the prime real estate of the Lid, the section of the canal closest to the harbors, favorably situated to attract tourists and sailors coming into port, but not the Crow Club. Kaz mused as he looked up at the black and crimson facade. It had taken a lot to lure tourists and risk-hungry merchants this far south for entertainment. Now the hour was coming up on 4 bells, and the crowds were still thick outside the club. Kaz watched the tide of the people flowing past the porticio's black columns, beneath the watchful eyes of the oxidized silver crows that spread its wings above the entrance. Bless the pigeons, he thought. Bless all you kind and generous folk, ready to empty your wallets into the dregs coffers and call it a good time. He could see barkers out front shouting to potential customers, offering free drinks, hot pots of coffee, and the fairest deal of all of Ketterdam. He acknowledged them with a nod and pressed further north. Only one other gambling den on the Stave mattered to him. The Emerald Palace, Pekka Rowland's pride and joy. The building was an ugly green, decked out in artificial trees, laden with fake gold and silver coins. The whole place had been done up as some kind of tribute to Rowland's Kalish heritage and his gang, the Dime Lions. Even the girls working the chip counters and tables wore glittering green sheaths of silk and had their hair tinted a dark, unnatural red to mimic the look of girls from the Wandering Isles. As Kaz passed the Emerald, he looked up at the false gold coins, letting the anger come at him. He needed it tonight as a reminder of what he'd lost, of what he stood to gain. He needed it to prepare himself for this reckless endeavor. Brick by brick, he muttered to himself. Those were the only words that kept his rage in check, that prevented him from striding through the Emerald's garish green and gold doors, demanding a private audience with Rowland's, and slitting his throat. Brick by brick. It was the promise that let him sleep at night, that drove him every day, that kept Geordie's ghost at bay, because a quick death was too good for Pekka Rowland's. Kaz watched the flow of customers in and out of the Emerald's doors, and caught a glimpse of his own steerers. Men and women he hired to seduce Pekka's customers, south with the prospect of better deals, bigger wins, prettier girls. Where are you coming from, looking so flush? One said to the other, talking far more loudly than necessary. Just got back from the Crow Club. Took 100 Krug off the house in just 2 hours. You don't say. I do. Just came up the Stave to get a beer and meet a friend. Why don't you join us? We'll all go together. The Crow Club. Who would have thought it? Come on, I'll buy you a drink. I'll buy everyone a drink. And they walked off together laughing, leaving all the patrons around them to wonder if maybe they ought to head just a few bridges down the canal and see if the odds were any kinder there. Kaz's servant agreed, luring them south like a piper with a flute in hand. He made sure to cycle steerers in and out, changing the faces so Pekka's barkers and bouncers never got wise. And customer by customer, he leached away the Emerald's business. It was one of the infinite tiny ways he'd found to make himself strong at Pekka's expense, intercepting his shipment of yurta, charging him fees for access to Fifth Harbor, undercutting his rent, and keeping his properties free of tenants, and slowly tugging at the threads that made up his life. Despite the lies he'd spread and the claims he made to Gills tonight, Kaz wasn't a bastard. He wasn't even from Ketterdam. He'd been 9 and Yordi 13 when they first arrived in the city. A check from the sale of their father's farm sewn safely into the inner pocket of Geordie's old coat. Kaz could see himself as he was then, walking the Stave with dazzled eyes, hand tucked into Geordie's so he wouldn't be swept away by the crowd. He hated the boys they'd been, 2 stupid pigeons waiting to be plucked. but those boys were long gone, and only Pekka Rollins was left to punish. One day, Rollins would come to Kaz on his knees, begging for help, if Kaz managed his job for Van Eck. That day would come much sooner than he could have ever hoped. Brick by brick, I will destroy you. But if Kaz had any hope of getting into the ice court, he needed the right crew, and the next hour's business would bring him a step closer to securing two very vital pieces of the puzzle. He turned onto a walkway, bordering one of the smaller canals. The tourists and merchants liked to keep it well lit through fairs, so the foot traffic here was sparser, and it made better time. Soon, the lights and music of West Stave came into view. The canal choked with men and women of every class and country seeking diversion. Music floated out of parlors where the doors had been flung open, and men and women lounged on couches in little more than scraps of silk and gaudy baubles. Acrobats dangled from cords over the canal, lithe bodies garbed in nothing but glitter, while street performers played their fiddles, hoping to garner a coin or two from passerby. Hawkers shouted at the sleek private gondolas of rich merchants in the canal, and the larger browboats that brought tourists and sailors inland from the Lid. A lot of tourists never entered the brothels of West Stave. They just came to watch the crowd, which was a sight itself. Many people chose to visit this part of the barrel in disguise, in veils or masks or capes, with nothing but a glint in their eye visible. They bought their costumes in one of the specialty shops off the main canals, and sometimes disappeared from their companions for a day or a week, or however long their funds held out. They dressed as Mr. Crimson or the Lost Bride, or wore the grotesque goggle-eye masks of the Madman, all characters from the comedy Brute. And there were the Jackals, a group of rowdy men and boys who cavorted through the barrels in red lacquered masks of sully fortune-tellers. Kaz remembered when Inej had first seen the jackal masks in a shop window. She hadn't been able to contain her contempt. Real sully fortune-tellers are rare. They're holy men and women. These masks that are handed around like party favors are sacred symbols. I've seen sully tellers ply their trade in caravans and pleasure ships in Inej. They didn't seem very holy. They are pretenders, making themselves clowns for you and your ilk. My ilk? Kaz had laughed. She waved her hand in disgust. Shivrati, she said. No nothings. They're laughing at you behind those masks. Not at me, Inej. I never lay down good coin to be told my future by anyone, fraud or holy man. Fate has his plans for us all, Kaz.